Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our February Green Living Live episode for today. My name is Caroline Chen. I'm the Social Justice Campaigns Manager here at Green America. And what that means is I oversee our labor campaigns. So that includes child labor in cocoa, that includes smartphone sweatshops, that includes educating consumers about labor issues within the apparel industry and other industries as well. So before we get started, sometimes folks will ask, well, how does labor fit into Green America's mission? You guys are an environmental nonprofit. And to which I say it's an important part of our mission. We are working to create a sustainable and just society for everyone. So a big part of that, of course, means that consumers have access to safe, natural options that are good for them and their family. But it's also important for us that everyone in the supply chain also has a fair shot at having a healthy life and a life of dignity. And so that's where our labor work comes in. We want to make sure everyone has a chance to participate in a sustainable economy. Furthermore, a lot of the sort of exploitative labor practices that we work with, whether it's in apparel or in child labor, they employ a lot of not the most environmentally friendly practices. And so by asking companies to make these shifts to become more sustainable throughout their supply chain, we're making communities healthier, helping with pollution in communities that are most, involved with the supply chain towards the beginning of it. So with that being said, thanks for joining us today on our chat about sustainable fashion and what the fashion industry is currently doing. If you have questions, please type them into the screen and the wonderful Kristen will read them. Regardless of whether you are someone who loves fashion and staying up to date with trends, or someone who just wears clothes because society tells us to, I think we can all agree that trying to shop ethically can be very challenging no matter your intentions. Some good news is that sustainability is the it word of the season and hopefully for the forever seasons. No longer is sustainable fashion relegated to sort of cliches of burlap sacks and unfashionable frumpy clothing that are uncomfortable. We are at the time when sustainable fashion is considered cool. There's been plenty of market research done that shows millennials and Gen Z, they really care about knowing where their clothes are coming from and how they're being made and under what circumstances, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. And so with that, we have this sort of growth of innovative, cool, hip clothing brands that, are very proud to talk about, where they're sourcing their clothes from, what factories they're from, or how many gallons of water are going into making the dress that you just wore. So it's great. It's great that after so many years of eco warriors championing, more green and sustainable options, this is the cool thing. And there's an increase in these in the options that you can shop at. Meanwhile, more conventional brands are also taking more looks into sustainability in what they do too. So that's anything from fast fashion companies starting to explore more about what sustainability means in an inherently unsustainable system, to even luxury brands. One example of this sort of mindset shift, within the industry is back in 2001, there was only one sort of luxury label that came out and said, we're going to be vegan and we're going to look at alternative textiles and just figure out a way to make these luxurious clothes, as sustainable as possible. And when this designer came out with this, bold, audacious goal, a lot of the fashion industry just kind of laughed at her and said, sure, you do that. But now fast forward to the last couple of years, the luxury brands are all starting to take deeper dives into their supply chains as well. So we have luxury conglomerates looking at where they're sourcing their different materials that go into their luxury items and trying to work with their supply chains to source them in a more sustainable manner as well. It's great that the fashion industry is starting to take a little more seriously just how much resources and effort and time goes into creating these clothes, and how we should be a little more aware of the life cycle of our clothes from the field to our bodies and beyond. That being said, there's a lot of great news about where we are right now, but there's also still a long ways to go for this fashion industry to really become sustainable. The textile production industry uses 93 billion cubic meters of water every year. That's a large number. When I read it, I was like, I don't even know how much that is. So to put things into perspective, it takes about 1,800 gallons of water to grow enough cotton to make a pair of jeans. And that's not including the water that is then used in the dyeing process and the finishing process, or the rest of the steps that go from cotton to your legs. Meanwhile, the textile industry uses 98 million tons of non-renewable resources a year. That's anything from oil to create synthetic fibers to the fertilizers that are used to grow cotton, or creating chemicals to dye and finish our clothing. Less than 1% of the material that is used to produce clothing is actually able to be recycled into new textiles. And so when you think about just how much resources the industry is using a year, that's problematic because all these resources are finite and we aren't able to just keep going with business as usual. A recent report estimates that about $100 billion worth of materials are lost from the system every year. And so the industry is going through this sort of a wake-up call right now where they're realizing sustainability isn't just a catchy new, phrase that they should be using to draw more consumers to them, but there's actually steps that should be taken to kind of address these sort of very alarming numbers. Meanwhile, with the rise of fast fashion, it's estimated that about half of fast fashion articles of clothing that are produced in a year also get disposed of within a year. And so when you put that into context of the resources, but also the labor that goes into that, it's not great either. Sweatshops are still a huge problem throughout the industry, both abroad and in the United States. And with this increase in demand of clothing production, workers have to deal with a lot of crazy quotas and unsafe working conditions, and depending on which stage of the supply chain they're in, they may have to live in communities that have to deal with the consequences of poor environmental practices. For instance, 20% of industrial water pollution comes from the dyeing and treatment of textiles. So those communities don't have clean water. They are working not the best jobs. It's not great for them. So there's still a lot to be done, and it's great that there are all these smaller independent businesses in the green business economy that are trying to do their part to improve things. But for the industry to change, large systemic changes will have to happen to how we think about how we produce clothing, how consumers purchase clothing, and our relationship to the clothes that we do wear. So a lot of these, a lot of companies now have all kinds of different programs to kind of start, at least on their websites, address these different, a lot of these different issues. Something that's been becoming more popular amongst sort of these kind of big name brands are recycling programs, where if you bring in clothing, they'll recycle it for you, and you get a special discount on your next purchase. One example I kind of want to dive into a little more is H&M's. As many of you know, H&M is a huge producer of fast fashion clothing. they're also trying to rebrand themselves as like a sustainable fast fashion alternative to some of the other fast fashion names. They have a line of clothes called the Conscious line, which is made from organic cotton. They have a big sustainable fashion event every year to kind of show off their latest lines of clothing that are made a little more sustainably. And they have this recycling program, which since 2013 has collected 56,000 tons of textiles. That sounds like a lot. It sounds very impressive. But a fashion industry expert from the University of Delaware estimates that H&M probably produced about 1.3 billion articles of clothing just last year. So that 260 million the 56,000 tons of textiles, which translates to about 260,000 t-shirts, is actually making a very tiny dent in just the vast quantity of clothing that they're producing every year. When you recycle clothing through this program or through a lot of programs, oftentimes what happens to your clothes is that most of it ends up going to a secondhand store. So it's not that different from when you just drop off clothes to a charitable organization or the PTO thrift store or whatever it is you currently do. And the clothes that aren't able to be salvaged, those usually get downstreamed and get turned into things like insulation or rags for auto shops or other kind of heavy duty use of clothes where it doesn't kind of matter where what the condition of the clothes are. Currently about a high estimate 5 to 10% of the clothing that they actually collect are able to be recycled in the sense of like recapturing the raw materials and repurposing them into textiles. And currently H&M is only producing 0.7% of their clothes using recycled materials. Those numbers aren't great, but a big reason why it is the way it is because of the current way the industry is set up. The fashion industry currently works in a very linear economy. So it starts from production, goes to disposal, and that's just kind of how it is. There isn't a ton of thought into, well, what are some steps we can include throughout the manufacturing process to make sure that we can recapture some more fibers or, reuse more materials throughout the process? It's very much just when you make clothes, the end goal is for them to end up probably in a dumpster in some form or another. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation recently released a report recommending that the entire fashion industry start taking a serious look at moving from this linear economy to a more circular economy, where all the different parts of the fashion apparel industry, whether it's manufacturing or textiles or dyeing or whatever, they all kind of come together and work together so they can better recapture all the much more of the raw resources that are going to clothing right now, because like all those scary numbers from earlier, the fashion industry uses a lot of finite resources in a year, and so it's not just good for the environment for them to start thinking that way, but also good for them and their bottom line to ensure that they can continue to have a more ready, stable supply of these different inputs that are needed to get us our clothes. So in addition to shifting to this kind of circular economy, we also need a lot more.
Sorry, I have one question.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, just as we're on the H&M. We have a question that is H&M sustainable fashion a form of greenwashing?
Yes. So when it comes to sort of sustainable and ethical clothing, sometimes you kind of have to pick and choose what you value when you're shopping. That being said, when a t-shirt ends up in a landfill, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it was made with conventional cotton or organic cotton, because that cotton has been through so much processing that it's just going to sit there anyways. And so there are definitely merits of debating, well, like, how, should we shop more alternative fabrics? Should we shop more organic? Well, like, how should we vote with our dollars? And there's no perfect answer, but when it comes to H&M, even if you are buying the cotton clothing and you are like taking good care of it, after it goes through that recycling process, it's very likely going to end up in a landfill anyways. And so inherently, when you're producing so much clothing, it's hard to be sustainable, even if you are doing these little things here and there. If you're using up that many resources to create that much clothing, and you're taxing that many communities, and putting that much input back into the landfill at the end. So it sounds nice, and it kind of sounds like an easy way out to kind of shop for like a $10 t-shirt, while also being sustainable. But ultimately, the clothes aren't necessarily higher quality at the end of the day either. Yeah.
Sorry.
No. That was a great question. That's kind of what I was hinting at with these kind of numbers. So thank you for asking that directly. So going back to this idea of the circular economy, one of the reasons why when we recycle clothing, not a ton of it is actually able to be converted to new textiles is just because of the current existing technologies we have when it comes to recycling, and just the kind of and how we approach making textiles. So when you blend, so oftentimes when you're buying clothing, a lot of the textiles are blended to help strengthen some of the weaker fibers within the textile. And then when textiles are getting recycled, they get shredded to their individual components, but then that weakens it again. So it's not a super great way to make new clothing. So this report advocates for more investments into, technology to more efficiently recycle textiles, and also more technology into strengthening textiles right now. So when you do recycle them, they don't, the quality isn't as compromised, but also just building that building that into the economy already. So that if you're already manufacturing textiles with the intention of saying, yes, at the end of this shirt's lifestyle, we're going to shred it down into its individual components and then repurpose it into a new textile. If you have that, like embedded in the system, that also just helps prevent some of these, issues that we are running into now when companies are trying to recycle existing textiles into new textiles. And there are a lot of companies out there who are trying to do innovative things when it comes to this. Examples are, like Patagonia has looking into a lot of innovative technologies and ways to just strengthen their textiles from the start so they can recycle them better. Eileen Fisher is sort of experimenting with their own sort of circular economy within their businesses, and so that involves them collecting clothing, sorting clothing, and then when it actually comes to recycling clothing, using the shredded material to actually create almost a new material, which then they use to create all new clothing. So there are some leaders taking this issue seriously, but ultimately, we need a lot more buy-in from all the different companies in order to make this sort of systemic change that needs to happen. One good thing is because of this report and its sort of very dark pronouncements, this idea of moving towards a circular economy is the new buzzword within the fashion industry, behind the scenes. So we're not going to see that for a couple of years, maybe, but I'm sure in a couple of years we'll see a lot more marketing around closed loops and improved technologies related to recycling. But for now, this was a good wake-up call. And if companies are serious about actually pursuing these sustainability initiatives that they're touting on their websites or their corporate social responsibility websites, then progress is good. Progress is not the opposition of perfect. So with all that being said, what are some things that we as consumers can do in the name of sustainable fashion and in the name of ethical fashion? The first things, the most important thing and probably the least glamorous thing I'm going to say is to consume less. It's not fun. It's not sexy, but ultimately, if we are more intentional about how much clothing we produce, we are buying, that will affect how much clothing is being produced and how much net new resources are being used every year to create the clothing. Lowering the demand will also help alleviate some of the pressure that workers have in sweatshops and factories. So instead of needing to meet crazy production quotas, that might help with that a little. It won't solve a lot of the labor problems going on, but it'll at least help give them some breathing room as labor activists continue to kind of work on those issues as well. Furthermore, if you're consuming less, you don't have to consider what do I do with my clothes when I'm done? Recycling apparently is maybe not as effective as I thought it was because it mostly goes to secondhand shops, or it gets exported to other markets in other countries, or gets repurposed into insulation or other heavy duty things that just end up in a landfill anyways. So if you're consuming less, you have fewer of those sort of questions to grapple with. That being said, it's very realistic to be like, I can't just give up shopping. I need new clothes sometimes. So another unglamorous but very helpful way to make sure that you are keeping your practices more sustainable and ethical is to shop secondhand more. We are now in an era where shopping secondhand no longer means you have to, it's kind of a lottery what you find at the store. There's still the traditional charity shops and secondhand stores where, if you look long enough, you can find that special thing. But there are also options where you can, where you can pick out what you need a little more specifically, whether that's the stores where you can actually sell sort of like current on trend clothing to online secondhand shops are pretty big now too. And they're fairly centralized, so it's easy to just say, I just need this one black cardigan for work. I'm just going to go to this website and I can find this gently loved, gently used cardigan that's new to me. Even the luxury game is getting into the secondhand, this sort of shop secondhand model. Consignment stores are now also big online as well. And they used to pitch themselves as, a place where you can get affordable luxury, but now they're also becoming more aware of just how continuing to lengthen the life of an article of clothing can be good for the environment. So they are starting to kind of tout that part of their business models as well. So you can look fancy for a little less and also a little better for the environment. And finally, for folks who are maybe a little more commitment adverse, renting clothes is also something that is becoming more of a commonplace thing. There are services where you can rent dresses for special occasions. There are now subscription boxes where a company will send you 4 or 5 new articles of clothing. You wear them until you're bored, and then you send them back, and they kind of cycle these clothes through their members. And so as that sort of industry grows, there will be more ways for you to shop new things and not have to actually keep them and deal with them when you're tired of them. Yeah.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Yes.
I shop pretty exclusively secondhand, but it's stores in my neighborhood in Baltimore. And I've looked at the online stores. I haven't dug deep, and I'm wondering, how do we know it's definitely secondhand clothing? Is there any sort of certification for these new online secondhand stores? Should we just trust that they are actually secondhand clothing? Is there any reason for us to question that?
I don't think there's any reason to question that. These are all very clear. It's either, they'll very clearly say we're a consignment store, or they very clearly say, the big selling point is you are getting these clothing from these brands that you love, but at cheap because they are pre-owned.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So there wouldn't be any reason to question.
I don't think so.
Sure.
Yeah. And even if they're like fishing things out of a dumpster to sell you or something, like at least they're still reusing the article, the clothing. So, and all of these.
No, I just was wondering if they were new. If there would be any reason to worry that those products were new.
I don't think so, because you can make a lot more money selling brand new articles of clothing. It's
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a comment and a question. A comment is that we should all shop our closets and find a retailer to help us update. Not everybody can upcycle their own clothes, which is a very good point. And I think there's a rule of thumb that you only wear 20% of your clothes 80% of the time.
That sounds about right.
There's also a question, do you have any statistics on how the fashion industry is a contributor to global warming?
Yes, I do. This Ellen MacArthur Foundation report projects that if the industry continues with business as usual, it could use more than the 26% of the allotted carbon budget associated with the 2-degree Celsius pathway by 2050, which is a lot. So, yeah. But so going back to the point of shopping your closets, another way to kind of keep clothes in circulation is to host clothing swaps. I participate in one pretty much every season. So when I'm tired of the sweaters that I've been wearing, the 20% of the sweaters I've been wearing 80% of the time all winter, I get together with folks and we just swap. And there is a rise of swaps within communities too. So I recommend, seeing if there's one near you. But for those times when you're like, secondhand is great, but sometimes you just need that new thing. Continue to support those green businesses that you have been supporting all this time. Our Green Business Network is a great resource for businesses that are that have been certified as businesses that do care about sustainability and the workers that are involved in the process. And I think a link to the green pages just got posted in the chat. Yeah, that's a great resource. There are definitely other certifications to keep an eye out for as well. Some to consider are the OCOTEX, which certifies textiles and makes sure they're not super toxic. The GOTS certification, which looks at cotton and organic, but also labor throughout the supply chain to produce an article of clothing as well. And of course, fair trade, which has historically done a good job of looking at the intersection between fair labor and making sure communities are doing well and engaging in more sustainable practices. That being said, certification is at the end of the day a tool. It's a helpful tool, but it itself won't necessarily fix all of the problems with the industry, but is still a very helpful shopping tool for consumers. I would also suggest not completely writing off a company right away if they're not certified, because certification can be expensive, especially if you are a small business. So make sure, if you have the time, to kind of look through their website and see what they're saying about their sourcing practices and what they're saying about how their workers are treated. If it's on the website and they're willing to share with you about it, it's hopefully all true and hopefully a good indication that it's a good business to support. If it's a little difficult to figure out what they're doing behind the scenes, then that would be something to be a little more, wary about. In addition to the different certifications, there are definitely some textiles that are better than others. and some that do contribute more to this sort of all the resources that are used every year. So avoid, synthetic fibers, like polyester, like rayon. They take a lot of new resources every year to make. Alternatives to like synthetic fibers are recycled polyester, which is made from like water bottles and fishing nets and other post-consumer waste. It's still there's still a lot of sort of like experimenting with it going on right now, but for now, if you need a more sustainable option for like exercise clothes or hiking clothes or outdoors clothes, recycled polyester is a good fabric to look for. Another textile to avoid is rayon, whether it's viscose, whether it's bamboo rayon. These rayons are made from, plant products that go through so much, processing and toxins that actually, I believe the EPA like banned the production of it in the States a while back. Not sure if that got overturned or not, but there was a while where rayon was just too toxic to be made here. So if that's the case, you probably don't want that on your body either. But a good alternative to rayon is tencel, which is it's a rayon alternative. It's also made from plants, but it's made in a more closed loop cycle, so fewer toxins are released, and it's a little cleaner of a process to make. And obviously, things like linen and wool, those are great options as well. They're sturdy. They have a better chance of being reused and recaptured at the end of the day once, there's a better system for that.
Are there certifications for wool or linens or cottons? Like, is there, kind of like the fishing scale where it's like, are the animals treated well?
Yeah. So there are definitely certifications when it comes to wool too. And like Kristen pointed out, there's a wool certification for how the sheep were treated. There's all kinds of different cotton certifications about organics or labor practices, and the different certifications kind of have different sort of stringencies. So USDA certified organic cotton, that's really just organic cotton that's grown organically, but doesn't cover whether or not it's been treated to chemicals. And then other certifications actually look at the process of cotton becoming a textile and whether or not it's organic throughout the process. Another good alternative is hemp. Thanks to Karen. But yeah, so there's definitely a lot of alternative fabrics out there. And as companies continue to invest more in innovative alternative fabrics that may be less consuming of water or less toxic when they're getting processed, there'll be more information coming out about those as well. But right now, there's quite a number of sort of innovation labs exploring, this sort of space. And finally, if you're looking for some more like specific actions to take that can help maybe move the industry, Green America has a couple of different actions up right now. One really important thing to do is to get the fashion industry to increase its transparency. So we have a Go Transparent campaign that's asking a couple industry leaders like Ralph Lauren, Carter's, Forever 21, and Ross to commit to start publishing information about their suppliers. Right now, if you look at your shirt and it says made in China or made in Bangladesh, that's really all you know about the article of clothing. You don't know what factory it was made at and under what conditions. So by asking companies to go transparent, we can learn a little more about the cycle of the clothes. And if there are labor issues that come up in the supply chain, it's easier for activists to tackle the problem before it becomes too serious. So many of you will remember the collapse of Rana Plaza back in 2013. The industry was so untransparent back then that when activists wanted to know which companies were actually making their clothes in the factory, they had to go through the rubble and look for clothing labels to figure out which companies need to be held accountable, and use their influence to like better improve factories in Bangladesh. Out of that horrific tragedy, labor activists, unions, industries, and government got together and they came up with the Bangladesh Accord for fire and building safety. And basically it was a commitment to start making garment factories in Bangladesh safer for workers. So events like the Rana Plaza collapse or factory fires would become less frequent. So far, this Bangladesh Accord has it's been estimated to have helped improve the lives of 2 million workers at 1,600 factories, which is great. But that's just the start. There's still much more that needs to be done to make these buildings safer. There's still other industries that are not covered by this current Bangladesh Accord. And so when this original accord expires in May of 2018, a second accord will be going into place. And this one will strengthen sort of its mandate. It will cover not just garment workers, but also textile workers in Bangladesh. So it'll help cover, more garment workers in Bangladesh. And just continue to build on making factories safer, because this is, it's a long process. There's a lot that needs to be done. What they have been able to do is great, but it's just the first step. They need to keep going. So we have another action where we're asking some of the big fast fashion companies to commit to signing the second Bangladesh Accord. And I believe that link is also going onto the chat right now as well. We're asking companies that took place that were part of the first accord to just renew their commitment and just continue to support their workers in Bangladesh. And when we get these industry leaders to take these steps, like becoming more transparent or supporting safer factories, it's a green light to the rest of the fashion industry that like, hey, if we as like the bigwigs are doing it, you should be looking at it too. And the hope is by getting all these big names to like take these commitments, it'll just kind of start a ripple effect of change throughout the industry as well. And finally, before we dive to a more open Q&A, one of the questions I get asked the most is company X ethical? Or is company Y sustainable? And the answer is often very hard to gauge because of a lack of transparency in what companies are willing to share about their practices, which is why these initiatives are important, and we hope you will take action with us. But it's also important for consumers to continue to reach out to these companies. If you have a favorite company and you're not super sure what their sustainability commitments are, shoot them an email or tweet at them. This sort of paper trail of people caring about where their clothes are coming from and under what conditions, that really does make a difference. And so when it comes to strategizing what's next for these businesses, they can say, hey, we have all these consumers asking us about where we're sourcing our cotton from. What can we do to like bring the story to the public better? So reach out to your favorite companies, call them, email them, tweet at them, post about it on Facebook, be as public or as private as you want, and just ask them about what they're doing and tell them about the concerns you have with the fashion industry, the sustainability of it, the workers behind it, and just see what they have to say. If they're willing to kind of engage with you, that's promising. If they're like, we can't comment on this at this time, that's kind of a flag too. But yeah, so if you're wondering how sustainable or ethical a company is, just ask them. Yeah. So with that, that's the end of my monologue phase. How much time do we have?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so if you have any questions, please ask away in the chat. I will say the sort of garment industry and the textile industry is very complex. There's a lot of nuances and nooks and crannies. So apologies in advance if I don't have an answer to your question right off the top of my head, but I would be happy to follow up with you offline after the webinar is over.
What are some of the textiles that might be harmful to your health? Like you were saying, the rayon. Are there other things out there that maybe we should just avoid for that reason alone?
So a lot of textiles go through quite a lot of processing and toxic chemicals. So even if you're shopping for like a cotton t-shirt, like that has been treated quite a bit too. So the best answer would be to look for certifications like the GOT certification, where it's very actively looking at how much toxins are like being put into the sort of the processing phase of the production cycle. But it's hard to just say, well, cotton is a good alternative because it's natural, when a lot of times cotton does also go through a lot of chemicals and stuff.
Do you have any information about where the yellow bins that you see around various towns, where those clothes end up?
That's a great question. I wonder that a lot myself, and my hunch is a lot of it will, a lot of the secondhand clothes that we donate actually get shipped to other countries. The nicer clothes get shipped to Japan, and then there's kind of a horrible tiered system of like, based on where you are, you get the quality of the secondhand clothes you get. So sometimes a lot of them will end up, so for the bins themselves, I'm not 100% sure, but my guess is a lot of it will probably leave the country or go get turned into the sort of industrial insulation and the other sort of recycled, repurposed clothes.
Are there any apps that can give a rundown of ethics, work conditions, or animal cruelty?
There are definitely a lot of resources online where one example is projectjust.com. They go through I think it's project-just.com, but they go through sort of what's publicly available, and then they will rate different businesses based on like their sustainability commitments, their commitments to workers, and so if you're ever curious about like, oh, like I wonder how well J.Crew is doing, you can like type into their database and see what they think. That being said, some of these types of resources and guides might have different standards when it comes to what they think a sustainable company is. So it might not be completely aligned with what you think, but it's still a good starting point for when you're doing some research.
I think that's all the questions for now, unless anybody has any last minute questions that they'd like to put out. And we have somebody. There are green dry cleaning silicone based versus petrochemicals. Mm-hmm. Are those better for longevity of clothes, very effective cleaning, but much less abrasive, very gentle, and much less toxic, and no chemical smell? Is that correct?
This is something that's been on my list to check for a long time, mostly because I am just now starting to get to the point where I own clothes that need to be dry cleaned. So I don't have an answer for you right now, but that is a good push for me to look into it a little more. And if you leave your contact information with Kristen, I will happily follow up with you, and we can both figure this out together.
It looks like a few more questions are coming in.
Sure.
I'm just gonna. If we want to take some time now, sorry that I'm just a voice kind of off in the distance, but there are, we have 2 other webinars coming up in the month of February. Next week on Thursday at, again, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be talking about climate gardens and how you can help climate change with your climate garden. And the last one is it's the last month, it's the last Thursday in February, February 22nd, on redecorating your home in a sustainable manner. And again, that's on a Thursday at 3 p.m., so February 2nd. And you can go to our website to sign up for all of these. Oh, the last question, I think, is just the Project Just website seems to be down at this moment.
Oh, okay. Well, when it comes back up, please do try again, and hopefully it'll be back up the next time you check. But yeah, there are a couple of resources like that, but like I said, they all kind of have different standards when it comes to what they think constitutes as ethical. So some might be more ethical, some might be a little more strict than others, but this is a pretty well-rounded one.
Sorry, one more person is typing a question. Where do you like to shop if you have to go out and shop for your
So when I'm very lucky. I live near a very great secondhand store. But if I'm shopping online, there's a couple online retailers that I really like. And I think a lot of these will mostly just be for the ladies on the call. So apologies to the men. One of my favorites is Everlane. They do a really great job of just telling the story of where the clothes are coming from and like what exactly you're paying for. They do have men and women's clothing lines. It's a little pricey, but you are paying for something that's meant to last. So instead of spending $5 on a t-shirt every couple of months, you can buy a shirt that will hopefully last a little longer. I also like shopping at online consignment stores. So that's anything from ThredUp for more casual everyday clothing to something called the Real, which is more for special occasion clothing that I would like to own. But yeah, these sort of online secondhand stores are a great way to just kind of have more options when it comes to shopping secondhand. And there's a ton of other ones too out there. These are just kind of my go-to ones. Okay.
Great.
And if there are no more questions, I will bless and release you all to the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have questions, you're welcome to email me. My contact information is on the website. And for the folks who I said I would follow up with, we'll be in touch soon.